It was a cold and silent night when Gabriel Morgan, the young prosecutor known for his meticulous work, was called to the scene of a crime that would change the course of his life. The red and blue lights from the police cars reflected on the building's walls in the small town, casting irregular shadows down the street. The sirens had stopped, but the sound of voices from police officers and paramedics echoed through the damp air. Gabriel watched the commotion with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. He wasn't easily shaken, but something about that night felt wrong from the moment he received the call. David Mendez, a famous lawyer known for handling the city's most controversial cases, lay dead on the floor of his own home, motionless, his face frozen in an expression of anguish. Around him, furniture was overturned and books were scattered, as if a struggle had taken place. Gabriel observed the details, trying to understand exactly what had happened. However, what truly intrigued him was the message written on the wall, right above the body: "The end is only the beginning." The words echoed in his mind repeatedly. The end of what? The beginning of what? He had dealt with disturbing crimes before, but this one carried a darker atmosphere, as if something much larger was at play. He knelt by the body, examining the visible signs of a fight. A precise strike, delivered without hesitation, likely ended Mendez's life. Gabriel knew Mendez was a controversial figure, especially in recent years, as he had taken on cases that directly challenged the interests of the city's most powerful figures. This crime didn't seem random, but more like a carefully planned execution. While the forensic team analyzed the scene, Gabriel couldn't shake the feeling that the note was something more personal than professional. A message, perhaps, indirectly directed at him. He couldn't help but feel he was involved in something much deeper than he imagined. His suspicions began to solidify when Clara Donovan, a police investigator, approached with a tense look on her face. She seemed more disturbed than usual. "We have a problem," Clara said in a low voice, as if not wanting anyone else to hear. "This case, it's not as simple as it looks. There's something in between the lines, Gabriel. We need to be careful." Gabriel had known Clara for a few years. She was competent and didn't rattle easily. But now, there was genuine concern in her expression, something that made him pause for a moment. What did she know that he didn't? That was a question lingering in the air since the moment he had arrived at the crime scene. He stood up, turning his gaze away from Mendez's body and looking at Clara, but without asking questions. It wasn't the time for premature inquiries. He knew this case would demand much more than just technical analysis. It would involve secrets, influential people, and possibly decisions that could alter the course of his career. The next day, Gabriel locked himself in his office, reviewing the files Mendez had been working on before his death. There were piles of documents on various cases, but one, in particular, caught his attention: a dossier on corruption within the judicial system. It was big, something that would undoubtedly put many important figures in delicate situations. And Mendez's name was all over it, always as the lead attorney. It was clear that Mendez was about to expose something that could shake the city to its core. But why? And why now? As Gabriel examined the dossier, his phone vibrated. A new message appeared on the screen. No sender. Just 3 words: "You've been warned." His stomach twisted. There was no doubt this case was far from simple. The layers of mystery seemed to deepen, and he knew that, with each step, he was getting closer to something dangerous. He turned off his phone, pushing the message to the back of his mind, and returned to the documents. Mendez had been on the verge of exposing a scandal involving powerful figures, but Gabriel couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the only reason for his death. And the note? It kept hammering away in his mind. The end is only the beginning. The next morning, Gabriel found himself in his office, immersed in analyzing the vast dossier that Mendez had compiled before his death. The documentation was immense, and each page seemed to weigh more than the last. Cases of corruption, money laundering, and embezzlement were all there, in black and white, connecting high-ranking figures, judges, businessmen, and politicians. However, one specific page caught his attention with force. At the top, a familiar name, Edward Morgan, his father. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, feeling a growing pressure in his chest. His father, who had passed away under mysterious circumstances years ago, had always been an icon of integrity in his mind. A brilliant lawyer with a career that Gabriel aspired to reach, but now, seeing his name there, among those Mendez was about to expose, something inside him broke. How could his father be involved in something like this? He quickly skimmed through the documents related to Edward, looking for any clue that would explain this connection. What he discovered left him even more disturbed. His father wasn't just a passive spectator in the corruption scheme. The files suggested he was deeply involved, a key player in several shady transactions and illegal deals. Memories of his father's funeral flooded Gabriel's mind. The sudden death, apparently caused by a heart attack, had always seemed suspicious to Gabriel. But at the time, he had been too young to question or understand the complexities behind such a tragedy. Now, faced with the evidence, he began to wonder if his father's death had really been natural. Had Mendez discovered something so deep that it cost his mentor's life? As Gabriel reflected on these new revelations, his phone vibrated on the desk. It was Clara. He answered, still lost in his own discoveries. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tense and serious, as if she knew exactly what he was dealing with at that moment. "I found something you need to see." Gabriel hesitated for a moment, still processing the fact that his father might have been involved in such a massive scandal. But the urgency in Clara's voice convinced him. He hung up and headed to meet her, feeling the weight of the mystery growing heavier. On the way to the agreed meeting place, Gabriel could hardly get his thoughts off his father. He had always admired the man who raised him, someone who, in his eyes, represented everything that was right and just in the legal world. Now, as he reevaluated that image, it felt as though the ground was falling away beneath him, as if each piece of his life was being dismantled, one by one. When he arrived at the cafe where Clara was waiting, she was already seated, flipping through a notebook with a concerned look on her face. Gabriel sat down across from her without saying a word. Clara looked up, studying him for a moment before pushing a folder toward him. "This is bigger than we imagined," she began, her voice slightly lower than usual, as if afraid someone might overhear. "Mendez was about to uncover a scheme involving many important people, and from what I found, your father was in the middle of it." Gabriel took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. He had already suspected this, but hearing those words come from someone else made the situation even more real, harder to deny. He opened the folder and flipped through the documents Clara had gathered. It wasn't much different from what he had already seen, but there was a new detail: records of secret transactions, confidential meetings, and encrypted communications that Mendez had been about to reveal. "These documents are the key," Clara continued. "Mendez was killed because he was about to expose all this. And now, Gabriel, you're at the center of this story. If you keep investigating, you're going to be the next target." The threat was clear, but Gabriel couldn't back down. Even with his father involved, or perhaps because of it, he felt that he needed to see this through to the end. There was more at stake now than just justice. He needed to know what had really happened, both to Mendez and to his father. He closed the folder and looked directly into Clara's eyes. "I won't stop," he said firmly. "Whatever it is they're trying to hide, I'm going to find it." Clara sighed, visibly worried. "Then we need to be careful. From now on, no one can be trusted." Gabriel nodded, but the doubt had already been planted. Could he trust Clara? She was the only person he was working with directly, but in a game like this, loyalties could easily be bought or manipulated. When he left the cafe, Gabriel returned to his office with a renewed sense of determination. The mystery was only beginning to unfold, but one thing was certain: the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous the situation became. As he walked through the city streets, the cold wind whipping against his face, a certainty grew within him. He was involved in something much bigger than any case he had ever worked on. His family's past was intertwined with the present, and he knew that, to uncover the truth about Mendez, he would have to confront his own ghosts. Gabriel could barely process everything he had discovered about his father. The name Edward Morgan was now entangled in a web of corruption and secrets, something Gabriel had never imagined. But the revelations Clara brought only confirmed what he had feared since the moment he saw Mendez's dossier: his own family was involved in the mystery that had culminated in the murder. Back at his apartment, Gabriel felt the growing weight of the threats looming over him. The last conversation with Clara echoed in his mind, the idea that he could be the next target. It all seemed absurd, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from, but reality was relentless. The truth couldn't be ignored. As he sat at his desk, reviewing the documents once again, the silence in his home was interrupted by a sudden, short vibration. His phone, tossed in the corner of the desk, flashed with a new message. He picked it up hesitantly, already anticipating what was coming. When he opened the message, he saw it was another threat. 3 words, again with no sender: "You don't know." A chill ran down his spine instantly. The short, vague message, loaded with intent, made it clear that someone was watching him. Someone knew he was getting too close to something he shouldn't. And what disturbed him the most was the sense of powerlessness. He was dealing with invisible forces, people with enough influence to manipulate the system and evade justice. Gabriel knew he couldn't back down. With each threat, he felt more determined to see it through to the end. But at the same time, he began to question who he could truly trust. Clara had been an ally, but how far did her loyalty go? He had known her for years, but he had never imagined she could be involved in something like this. No matter how much Clara assured him she was on his side, he couldn't afford the luxury of trusting blindly. In the days that followed, the threats intensified. One morning, as he left his house, he realized his car brakes had been tampered with. A near accident, avoided by luck, but the warning was clear. They were getting closer, and Gabriel felt the growing pressure that every move he made was being watched. He spent most of that day at the courthouse, trying to focus on other cases while his mind kept drifting back to what was happening behind the scenes. That same day, when he returned home, he found the door slightly open. His heart raced, panic rising within him. He tried to control his breathing before carefully pushing the door open. Inside the apartment, chaos awaited him. Drawers had been pulled out, papers scattered across the floor, and everything he owned seemed to have been tampered with. He carefully walked around the room, looking for any sign of who might have done this, but there was nothing indicating who had broken in. One thing, however, was clear: they were searching for something. But what? Gabriel knelt to pick up some of the scattered papers and noticed that Mendez's dossier, which he had kept locked in a drawer, was open. The pages were strewn everywhere, as if someone had rifled through them in a hurry. He wondered if they had found what they were looking for. If they had, that meant he was in even greater danger than before. Feeling exposed, Gabriel grabbed his phone and called Clara. There was an urgency in his voice that he couldn't hide. "They broke into my house," he said bluntly. "They're coming after me, Clara. I don't know how much longer I have before they make a move." On the other end of the line, Clara was silent for a few seconds, just long enough for Gabriel to feel a wave of suspicion. But then she responded, her voice firm and professional as ever. "We'll take care of this, Gabriel. Don't let them break you. Find a safe place and tell me where you are. We'll meet soon. He knew he couldn't stay in that apartment any longer, so he quickly packed what he could and left, looking both ways before getting into his car. The weight of the situation was starting to suffocate him. He didn't know how far the conspiracy went, but one thing was certain: they wouldn't stop until he either gave up or was eliminated. As he drove through the city, his thoughts turned back to his father. The image Gabriel had of Edward Morgan was unraveling fast, turning into something distorted and dark. Could his father really have been a central figure in all of this, helping to fuel a corruption scheme involving such powerful figures? Or had Edward tried to get out, and that's why he ended up dead? These questions burned in his mind, but the answers were still out of reach. He parked his car in a remote spot and sat for a few minutes, trying to organize his thoughts. Things were falling apart quickly. Gabriel knew that if he wasn't careful, he could end up like Mendez, or worse, like his father. When he finally got out of the car, he realized there was no turning back. He was involved in something far bigger than a simple legal case. Mendez's life, the corruption, the threats, his own father, everything was connected in a way Gabriel couldn't fully understand yet. But one thing he did know: he couldn't trust anyone. Not even Clara. The path he had chosen was dangerous, but Gabriel was determined to uncover the truth. Every threat only strengthened his resolve to expose those responsible. However, with each step, he knew he was playing a deadly game where any mistake could be his last. Gabriel spent the night wide awake, replaying the events of the past few days in his mind. The break-in at his apartment, the threatening messages, and the discovery of his father's involvement in Mendez's scheme all swirled together, forming a tangled web of unanswered questions. He had moved to a simple hotel, far from the city, hoping to avoid being tracked, but the feeling of being watched persisted. The next morning, as he tried to organize his thoughts, his phone rang. It was Clara again. There was an urgency in her voice, something Gabriel hadn't noticed before. She asked him to come to her office as soon as possible, saying she had made important discoveries. Though Gabriel remained cautious, he knew he couldn't ignore the call. When he arrived at the agreed location, Clara greeted him with a serious expression, different from the usual calm she maintained even in the most tense situations. They sat in a private room, far from the curious ears of the other officers. Clara pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on the table, sliding it toward Gabriel. "There's something you need to see," she said, her voice heavy with gravity. Gabriel opened the folder slowly, feeling the tension in the air build. Inside was a series of financial records and encrypted emails, all dated years ago when his father was still alive. Each transaction, every communication, pointed to Edward Morgan's active participation in a corruption scheme involving powerful figures in the city. Judges, businessmen, and politicians, all their names were there. However, what shocked Gabriel the most was a handwritten note at the bottom of one of the documents: "He's betraying us." The impact of those words was immediate. It seemed Edward wasn't just a passive participant in the scheme, he had been trying to get out, maybe even expose those involved. This explained a lot, including his sudden death. Gabriel closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process what it all meant. His father, the man he had always considered a hero, had been entangled in a deadly game much bigger than anyone could have imagined. And now, Gabriel carried the weight of that legacy. Clara watched Gabriel in silence, waiting for him to process the magnitude of the revelations. When he finally looked up, there was something different in his expression, a mix of determination and disillusionment. "This changes everything," Gabriel said, his voice steadier than he expected. "My father was trying to get out, wasn't he? He knew he was in danger, and that's why they killed him." Clara nodded slowly, though there was still a shadow of doubt in her eyes. "It looks that way. But we have to be careful, Gabriel. If they killed your father for trying to leave, imagine what they'll do to you if they think you're getting too close. Gabriel knew she was right, but he couldn't afford to back down now. He was determined to see it through, even if it meant risking his own life. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the puzzle was still incomplete. There was something he wasn't seeing clearly yet, something Mendez had known, and that was tied to his father's death. And Mendez? Gabriel asked, shifting his focus momentarily. He knew all of this. Is that why he was killed? Clara hesitated before answering. Mendez was investigating something much bigger. He didn't just know about your father's involvement, he knew about other important figures who were actively trying to keep the scheme hidden. I believe Mendez was about to expose everything. Gabriel nodded, absorbing every word. He felt the weight of the revelations, but also a growing need to uncover the full truth. He couldn't stop now. There was more at stake than he had ever imagined. Mendez's murder, his father's death, the constant threats, everything was interconnected in ways he still needed to fully understand. But then, something in Clara's expression changed. There was tension, a hesitation Gabriel had never seen in her before. It was subtle, but he noticed. Something was off. He studied her face for a moment, feeling a slight wave of suspicion rise within him. Could it be possible that Clara was hiding something? He stood up, still holding the documents in his hands. I need some time to process all of this, he said, avoiding direct eye contact. Clara nodded, but Gabriel noticed she seemed relieved. That only made him more suspicious. Leaving Clara's office, Gabriel decided he needed to start investigating on his own. He couldn't trust anyone blindly, not even someone he had worked so closely with. If his father had been betrayed by those he trusted, Gabriel couldn't make the same mistake. He knew the investigation was heading in a dangerous direction, and each new step brought him closer to discovering something that could cost him his life. As he drove aimlessly through the city streets, Gabriel reflected on the clues he had in hand. What had really led to Mendez's death? Was it the same reason that had cost his father's life? And why was he now being pursued? He pulled the car over in a secluded spot and grabbed his phone. He called Clara again, but this time, his tone was more cautious. Clara, he began, trying to keep his voice casual, I need you to meet me later. There's something that still doesn't add up, and I think we need to go over a few things together. On the other end, Clara hesitated for a moment before answering. Sure, Gabriel. Let me know where. As he hung up the phone, Gabriel knew that, from that moment on, he would have to stay 2 steps ahead of everyone. Clara might still be an ally, but the shadow of doubt had already been cast. He couldn't trust anyone fully anymore, especially not with the constant threat hanging over him. With every new discovery, the danger grew, and Gabriel knew he was getting closer to a truth that no one wanted to see revealed. After the call with Clara, Gabriel drove aimlessly for some time, trying to organize his thoughts. With each new revelation, the case grew more complex, and the web of corruption revealed itself to be broader and more intricate than he ever could have imagined. His father was involved, Mendez had been killed for getting too close, and now Gabriel himself was the next target. He knew that his next move would be critical. Determined not to trust Clara blindly, Gabriel decided to conduct a parallel investigation. He needed to understand the connections between his father, Mendez, and the powerful figures in the city, but in a way that wouldn't expose him further. He was certain that people were watching his every move, and any misstep could be fatal. Gabriel returned to his apartment that afternoon, now cautious with every movement. Before entering, he surveyed the area, ensuring there were no suspicious individuals nearby. The constant feeling of being watched wouldn't leave him, but at that moment, he knew he had to take risks if he wanted to uncover the truth. Inside the apartment, Gabriel began reviewing Mendez's dossier once again. There was something he felt he had overlooked, a connection he hadn't yet made. He sifted through the documents, trying to piece it all together. Most of the evidence was related to financial transactions, illegal contracts, and the names of political figures tied to the scheme. But then, one specific page grabbed his attention. It was a list of secret meetings between businessmen and members of the judiciary, all held at a private club in the city. Edward Morgan's name appeared at several of these meetings. This made Gabriel stop for a moment. If Mendez had been on the verge of exposing this network of secret meetings, this could be the key to everything. Gabriel jotted down the information and decided to investigate the club further. Maybe there, he could find new leads or even witnesses who could shed light on Mendez and his father's deaths. But before he could make any further progress, the phone rang again. It was Clara. She sounded nervous, more than usual. "Gabriel, I found something you need to see. This could change everything." Suspicion lingered, but Gabriel knew he didn't have many options. Whether Clara was involved or not, he would need to stay close to her to uncover the truth. They agreed on a new meeting spot, and this time, Gabriel resolved to keep an even closer eye on her. When he arrived at the meeting point, in a discreet part of the city, Clara was already waiting for him with a folder in her hands. She seemed tense, almost as if she was under some kind of pressure. Gabriel approached slowly, a mix of curiosity and caution growing with each step. "These documents prove your father was involved, but not in the way you think," Clara said, her voice low and serious. Edward was working from the inside to bring the whole thing down. He knew Mendez would be next, so he tried to act first. But he was betrayed by someone he trusted. Gabriel looked at Clara, filled with suspicion. The revelations made sense, but something still didn't add up. Who had betrayed his father? And why was Mendez killed immediately afterward? Gabriel knew Clara was telling part of the truth, but there was something she wasn't revealing. Before he could ask any further questions, a car slowly drove past them, its headlights flashing in their direction. Gabriel felt panic rising, his survival instincts kicking in. "We need to get out of here," he said, pulling Clara out of sight. They ducked into a nearby alley, watching the car disappear around the corner. The threat was always looming. "They're watching us, Gabriel," Clara said, breathless. "We need to be more careful. Whoever's behind this won't stop until we're silenced." Gabriel knew she was right. Every new discovery brought them closer to danger. But now, with the evidence in hand, he had to make a decision. Should he take the documents to the police and try to take down the scheme from within? Or continue his own investigation, risking being eliminated before he had the chance to expose the truth? "I'm not stopping, Clara," he said, his voice firm. "This ends here, no matter what it takes." Clara nodded, but Gabriel still felt the shadow of doubt. There was something in her behavior that made him uneasy, but he couldn't afford to lose focus now. The web of corruption was unraveling, and he knew he was getting closer to the heart of it all. With the documents in hand, Gabriel returned to the hotel where he had been hiding out, his mind racing. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, but there was no turning back now. His father had tried to expose the truth and paid the ultimate price. Mendez followed the same path. Now, it was Gabriel's turn. He spent the night reviewing the documents, trying to come up with a strategy for what came next. The private clubs seemed to be the key. That's where the secret meetings took place, and where decisions that affected the entire city were made. If Gabriel could expose those meetings and the people involved, he might have a chance to bring down the entire scheme. But he knew that by doing so, he would be putting himself directly in the line of fire. At dawn, Gabriel stood up from the table, exhausted but determined. He would do whatever it took to uncover the truth about Mendez and his father's deaths, even if it meant risking everything. The next step would be to find out what was really happening at the club. And Gabriel knew this investigation would be his most dangerous move yet. Gabriel spent the next few days gathering as much information as he could about the private club, which seemed to be at the center of the entire corruption scheme. Its discreet location and the secrecy surrounding its members made it difficult to gain access, but Gabriel knew he would need to enter that place to obtain concrete proof. He investigated cautiously, reaching out to trusted contacts and looking for clues online, but the protection around the club was tight. There were no clear leads on how he might infiltrate it, and time was running out. With every step he took, the feeling of being watched intensified, but that only fueled his determination. One late afternoon, Gabriel received an unexpected message from Clara. She sounded agitated, her voice tense over the phone. "Gabriel, I found a lead on the club. But we need to meet now. I can't talk over the phone." Suspicious, but without many options, he agreed to meet her in a remote part of the city, at a spot they had used for meetings before. Gabriel knew any mistake could be fatal, but if Clara had really found a way into the club, he had to take the risk. When he arrived at the agreed location, Clara was nowhere to be seen. He looked around, feeling the cold wind biting at his skin as he waited. Minutes passed, but still no sign of her. Then Gabriel heard the sound of tires screeching in the deserted street. A black car pulled up on the other side of the road, and two men quickly got out. Gabriel sensed the danger before he could even react. He tried to move, but it was too late. The two men grabbed him from behind, and before he could fight back, he felt a sharp blow to the back of his head. The world around him went dark. When he woke up, Gabriel found himself in a dark room, his hands tied behind his back and his head pounding with pain. He blinked repeatedly, trying to adjust his eyes to the dim light. He was in some sort of basement or abandoned room, the smell of mold thick in the air. The only light came from a small window high on the wall, revealing a desolate scene. The cold cement floor and dirt-streaked walls suggested the place wasn't used often. Gabriel felt the tight ropes cutting into his wrists, each movement sending sharp pains through his arms. He struggled to remember how he had ended up here, and the image of the two men approaching Clara flashed back in fragments. Had she been abducted as well? A distant door creaked open, and Gabriel heard footsteps echoing in the room. One of the men who had captured him appeared, dragging a chair and placing it directly in front of him. The man's silence was intimidating, and Gabriel knew he was dealing with someone who had no intention of talking. Soon after, another man entered the room. This one seemed to be in charge, dressed in an expensive suit with a cold, calculated expression. He stared at Gabriel with disdain before sitting in the chair, crossing his legs as he observed the prosecutor with a slight smirk. "You've gone too far, Morgan," the man said, his tone calm and controlled. "Your father knew when to stop, but for some reason, you think you can change something." Gabriel, still dizzy, tried to focus. "My father was killed because he tried to leave, wasn't he?" He forced the words out, hoping to get an answer that would help him piece together the final parts of the puzzle. The man smiled, but it wasn't a smile of sympathy. "Your father made his choice. He knew the consequences, just like Mendez. And now, you're about to follow the same path, unless you decide, right now, to stop this investigation." Gabriel didn't respond immediately, calculating his options. He didn't have enough evidence to bring down the entire scheme, but he knew he was close. If he could get out of there alive, he would have to move quickly. And then there was the question of Clara. Where was she? "You think you can stop all of this?" the man continued. "We've controlled this city for decades. You're not the first to try and take us down, and you won't be the last. But they all end up the same way. Silenced." Gabriel felt the anger rising within him. Every word from the man only fueled his resolve to expose the truth, to bring down the empire of corruption that had taken his father's life and Mendez. But first, he needed to find a way out of there. He looked the man in the eyes, ignoring the pain in his head and the ropes cutting into his wrists. "You can threaten me all you want, but I'm not stopping. Neither my father nor Mendez could finish this, but I will." The man shook his head, chuckling softly. "Courage is admirable, but it's not enough. Let's see what the future holds for you." With that, he stood up and left the room, leaving Gabriel alone with his thoughts and the throbbing pain in his body. Time was running out, and Gabriel knew he needed to find a way to escape before it was too late. But something inside him told him Clara was still alive. She hadn't betrayed him. At least, he hoped she hadn't. The silence after the man left was almost deafening. Gabriel was alone in the dark, his head pounding and his thoughts spinning in a whirlwind of uncertainty. He tried to free his hands from the ropes, but the knots were tight. The constant pain in his head wasn't helping his concentration, but he knew he had to stay calm. His survival depended on it. As the minutes passed, Gabriel's mind cleared enough for him to focus on one thing: finding Clara. She was tangled up in this mess too, and he had to believe she was still alive, somewhere close by. The thought that she had also been taken, maybe suffering the same fate as him, only made the sense of urgency grow stronger. He scanned the room, his eyes now adjusted to the darkness. He strained against the ropes again, twisting his wrists in an effort to loosen them. It took longer than he would have liked, but eventually, he managed to free one hand. Moving quickly, he untied the other wrist and stood up, feeling the cold floor beneath his shoes. Gabriel was determined to get out of there and find a way to turn the tables. He knew the men who had captured him underestimated his resolve, and that would be his greatest advantage. If he could escape, he might still be able to bring the entire scheme down. But first, he had to find Clara. He crept toward the door, testing the handle. It was unlocked. That surprised him, but there wasn't time to question it. They were confident he wouldn't escape, which only made him more eager to prove them wrong. Moving through the narrow, dark hallway, Gabriel heard muffled voices in the distance. He quickly ducked away from the sound, knowing he had to be cautious. His mind raced, trying to anticipate the next move of those who had imprisoned him. Finally, he found another door at the end of the corridor. Slowly, he opened it and found Clara inside. She was tied to a chair, looking exhausted but alive. Gabriel hurried over to her silently and began untying her. "I knew you weren't on their side," Gabriel whispered, his voice low but firm. Clara looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and fear. "I couldn't say anything, they were watching us the whole time," Clara said, as Gabriel finished untying her hands. "I was investigating on my own, trying to figure out who was pulling the strings." Gabriel nodded. Despite everything, he still had his doubts, but now, with danger imminent, he knew he had to trust Clara, at least for the time being. They were in this together. "We need to get out of here and find a way to expose what's going on," Gabriel murmured, helping Clara to her feet. "Those men think they can stop us, but now we know enough to bring them down." The two of them moved quickly, trying to make as little noise as possible. They knew that once they were discovered, they'd have little time before being caught again. They crept down the dimly lit corridors, hearing the echo of their own footsteps. Every second was a mix of adrenaline and fear, and Gabriel knew they were taking a huge risk. They reached a side exit without being seen. As they opened the door, the cool night air hit them, and Gabriel took a deep breath, feeling a momentary relief from the tension. But they weren't safe yet. Off in the distance, they could hear the sound of cars idling. It was only a matter of time before they were found. Clara pointed to a small road leading back toward the city. If we can make it there, we might be able to hide until we come up with a solid plan. They started running toward the road, trying to move quickly without drawing attention. Each step felt like an eternity, the fear of being caught at any moment hanging over them like a shadow. When they finally reached the road, Gabriel stopped to look around. They were safe for now, but he knew it wouldn't last long. Clara pulled out her phone, but there was no signal. There was no way to call for help yet. "We need to find a secure place," Gabriel said, his voice firm but tired. "We'll need more than courage to take these people down. They control everything, and if we don't act fast, we'll be next." Clara nodded, staring out at the horizon where the city's lights flickered in the distance. "We need solid evidence. Something no one can deny." "I know where we can get it," Gabriel replied, his eyes steely with determination. "At the club. It all started there. And that's where we'll finish it." They both knew that to expose everything, they'd have to return to the place where the scheme began. The private club, home to the secret meetings and the heart of the corruption, would be the stage for the final showdown. There was no more running. The only way to end this was to confront their enemies on their own turf. With one final glance between them, Gabriel and Clara started walking toward the city, knowing they were only a step away from the climax of this battle. Everything they had gone through had prepared them for what was coming. There was no turning back. Gabriel and Clara arrived in the city early in the morning, exhausted but resolute. The journey to the private club would be dangerous, but they knew it was the only way to expose the corruption. The past few hours had been a race for survival, and now they were on the brink of the climax of their investigation. It was there, in that luxurious and secretive place, where they would find the definitive proof to bring down those responsible. "We have to move fast," Gabriel said, looking at Clara with a mix of worry and determination. "If they see us coming, it's over." Clara nodded silently. She knew Gabriel was right. They had barely escaped last time, but the danger was still present. The tension between trusting each other completely lingered in the air, but at that moment, they knew they needed each other to win this fight. As they approached the club, they parked the car some distance away to avoid drawing attention. The building was imposing, surrounded by high walls and security cameras discreetly placed around. During the day, the club operated as a meeting place for the city's elite, but at night, according to Mendez records, it hosted secret gatherings that directed the city's most corrupt decisions. "We need to get inside without being seen," Clara said, scanning the area. "There's a side entrance Mendez mentioned in his notes. It might be our only chance." Gabriel followed Clara as she led him toward a narrow passage along the club's side. The entrance was well hidden, but Clara's keen eye found it. Using the tools they had brought, they deactivated the security system and slipped inside. The interior of the club reeked of luxury and power. They moved through the empty hallways, the dim lighting casting shadows that seemed to follow them with every step. Gabriel remained on high alert, feeling the weight of what was at stake. Mendez was dead, his father was implicated, and now his own life was on the line. Everything hinged on what would happen next. As they approached a large room in the back of the building, they heard muffled voices. Gabriel looked at Clara and nodded. The room where the secret meetings took place was just ahead. They positioned themselves near the slightly ajar door, listening carefully. Inside, Gabriel immediately recognized several of the city's most powerful figures. Judges, businessmen, politicians, everyone Mendez had named in his files was there. But what froze him in place was the man sitting at the head of the table. It was the same man who had kidnapped and threatened him not long ago. Gabriel listened as fragments of their conversation floated through the air. They were discussing how to cover their tracks and, more importantly, how to eliminate any remaining threats. His name was mentioned. They knew he was getting too close to the truth. Clara stepped forward, leaning closer to hear better. But in doing so, she accidentally knocked over a small object nearby, creating a slight noise that echoed in the quiet room. The voices inside fell silent immediately. "What was that?" someone inside asked. Gabriel and Clara exchanged nervous glances. They knew there was no more time for subtlety. Before they could move, the door was thrown open, and two armed men appeared, pointing their weapons directly at Gabriel and Clara. They were quickly disarmed and brought into the room, where the powerful figures Gabriel had recognized now stared at them coldly. "I knew you wouldn't give up," the man at the head of the table said, his tone devoid of emotion. "You're just like your father, unable to see the bigger picture. But now, it's over." Even trapped and cornered, Gabriel kept his gaze steady on the man. "My father tried to make things right, and you killed him for it. But you're not getting away with this." The man chuckled, a cold, empty sound. "Your father knew when to stop. You, however, seem to have a misguided sense of justice. What do you think you're going to do? Take down an entire city? Do you think people will believe you?" Gabriel stayed silent, his mind racing. He knew the files Mendez had collected would be key to bringing everything down, but he needed something more, something undeniable. That's when Clara, who had been quiet until then, stepped forward. "You underestimate the truth," she said, her voice firm. "We have everything documented. Every transaction, every deal. There's no escaping this." The man looked at Clara with a slight smile. "You really think you can threaten me with papers and files?" But before he could say anything more, the sound of loud sirens echoed outside. The club had been surrounded by the police. Clara had been quick enough to send a message before they entered. It was the break they needed. The men around the table began to panic. Gabriel and Clara were released by the police officers who stormed the club. Finally, the evidence they had gathered would be used to bring down the network that had controlled the city for so long. But as the criminals were arrested, Gabriel couldn't shake the thoughts of his father. Edward had been a key player in that corrupt game, but in the end, he had tried to do the right thing. And now, Gabriel had finished what his father had started. Clara approached Gabriel, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We did it, Gabriel." He looked at her, still feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "Yeah, we did. But at what cost?" The city was about to face a massive upheaval, and Gabriel knew his name would be at the center of it all. He had chosen justice, but the price had been too high. Mendez, his father, and even himself, all of them were bound to a fate they never asked for. But at least now, the truth had finally come to light. As the sirens and chaos around him began to fade, Gabriel looked up at the sky, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but revenge was never his goal. All he ever wanted was the truth. And now, finally, he had it.